Hi, welcome to my presentation. My name is Chris Garland, and I'm going to be talking about meta-analysis and gamification. My name is Christopher Garland, as you can see right here. I graduated from Woosong, back in 2016? We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, here's my contact information if you want to get in touch with me at a later date. My email address is christophermgarland@gmail.com. You can also reach me at cmgarland@hanbat.ac.kr. Before I actually get into the meat of this presentation, I want to talk a little about myself first. So I've lived in Korea for over 10 years now. I came here first in 2009, and let's see, my undergrad, I studied psychology and communications, and then my graduate school, of course, was TESOL and English with a TESOL concentration. I've got experience teaching pretty much all level in Korea, which is something I feel is a little unique. I've taught elementary school, middle school, high school, and university, adults, everything. So I sort of have run the gamut and met many different kinds of students and had the opportunity to try lots of different things. My interests in terms of sort of research would be, motivation. Of course, how can we get our students motivated and keep them going? Gamification, which is, of course, the topic today. And L2 in the classroom. I speak a little bit of Korean, being that I've lived here for 10 years. So I'm always interested in how it can be utilized in the classroom and how that impacts our teaching and our students. What we're going to talk about today in this presentation is quite a bit, actually. Basically, I'm talking about my master's thesis, which I conducted to graduate. It's a little bit statistics heavy, so numbers are fun, right? So I hope you enjoy that. So first, I'm going to give an overview of meta-analysis and sort of briefly underline and illustrate what it is, so that hopefully you can follow and understand what I did. Then I'm going to talk about gamification itself and what that is, followed by a little bit about motivation, and then gamification of learning. It's a little different than just general gamification. Then I'll actually talk about my study and the methods I used, and then the results of that study, and finally the implications and the how and why we could use gamification in our classrooms. So, meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is sort of a special way of doing research in that you don't actually conduct any study with participants. At the time I was doing my master's, I was working in a middle school, and they weren't too keen on me using our students for research. I wasn't really giving grades at that time either. So it was a little hard for me to actually do experiments with students. So this was one method that was proposed to me. So what a meta-analysis basically is you look at different studies that have already been published, and then you find and compare data from that. So that allows comparisons for, we say, across populations. So for example, one study looks at middle school students in Taiwan, and another study looks at elderly people in Sweden, but it still studied gamification. You can actually compare those studies. The way that works is we find certain things called moderator variables. Now, what a moderator variable is something that might not have been the focus of a study, but exists in the study anyway. So for example, if a study of smokers talks about how they drink coffee every day, and then a different study about tea drinkers also talks about smoking, both studies have smoking as a constant. So you can sort of pull that variable out and compare the two different studies. So that's basically what a meta-analysis is. We're just getting pieces from different studies that allow us to compare the studies against each other and sort of create a new sample. Now, to do this, we need to have certain inclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria is basically your criteria for what you're including in a study or not. So lots of studies you'll see, like case studies, where they just follow one population and watch them over time. Sometimes there's also lots of qualitative research, where they just sort of describe what happened. For a meta-analysis, we sort of need more information. We have to calculate things like effect size. We need means, standard deviations. We need numbers. So inclusion criteria is actually really important. You have to be pretty strict, and you have to make sure that the studies that you find and use actually fit and are helpful for your research. I ran into this problem, which we'll talk about later. So then the method, basically, once you have all that information, you calculate some effect sizes, and that allows you to compare the different studies. You can do that by hand. I read a nice 600-page book on how to conduct a meta-analysis when I did my research. And then I still used a computer program. Understanding it's really important, but once you get the basics of it, actually doing the research, it's easier to use something like SPSS and sort of put your information in there and do it like that. So that's a little about meta-analysis, and sort of a general idea of what that is. Now let's actually talk about gamification. The focus of this actual presentation is on gamification in learning. But before we understand gamification in learning, we need to actually understand the idea of gamification itself. So gamification is dealing with motivation. You're trying to motivate your audience, motivate your user to do something. What that is, that's up to you, the creator. It's really common in marketing and business. Essentially, the definition is you take a non-game activity and you put game elements in it, or on it, or around it somehow. There's been a few different definitions, a few different ways people look at it. Here we see Dederin and others et al. He came up with 5 levels of gamification. There's interface design patterns, game design patterns and mechanics, design principles and heuristics, game models, and game design methods. So those are different ways you can gamify. Bedwell, Pavlas, Hain, Lazara, and Salalas, they came up with 9 categories of game attributes. This was more for serious games, but Landers in 2014 sort of put this towards gamification. These can include things like levels, instantaneous feedback, leaderboards, collaborative working, things like that. There's lots of different attributes and lots of different ways games can be used. We also see like game fiction. Some places will have an avatar. But the important thing to remember about all this, not all of them are required. If you have 2 or so game elements, then we can consider that gamifying. You don't have to have all 9 for something to be considered gamification. So what that means is that there's lots of different variants. Some studies you'll find some gamification methods only have 1 or 2 things, where others are almost like an actual game. So that's a little about gamification. Now let's talk a little about motivation. Motivation, there's sort of 2 different kinds that people traditionally talk about: extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation, you can think of that as when motivation is coming from the outside. So when your mother or your wife or your teacher pushes you to do something, that's when you're being motivated extrinsically. Versus intrinsically is like, oh, I really want to do a good job at this. That's your internal motivations. It turns out maybe they're actually sort of combined and always working together. Not everything is so black and white. The important thing to remember about motivation, though, is that it has been found very important for language learning. Students that aren't motivated, I'm sure all of you've seen this in your own classrooms. If a student isn't motivated, they're not really going to get as much learning done as someone that is really motivated. So, gamification and learning is what I wanted to study. Ideally, I would have studied language education, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So, the important thing to know is that there's been lots of mixed results in gamification and learning. Some studies show like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, look how motivated my students are. Others show that students don't really care or don't like the game design or something like that. There's also, as we said earlier, lots of different elements used in gamification. And from what we've found in the research, there's lots of different gamification elements used when we gamify learning. Variety. Again, some schools or classes will use leaderboards or badges to keep it simple. Some go so far as making quests and using game language. There's lots of variety. That also includes the subjects. Lots of research has been done in sort of STEM fields, science, math, computer-related fields, but it's also been done in things like art and design, even language education. However, there seems to be a sort of lack of language education gamification at this point, or rather at the point of this study, which was conducted 2015 fall. So we can apply game elements to the classroom. How it works and how effective it is what this study wanted to find out. The study had 3 big research questions. The first was the effect. Basically, what is the effect of gamification on learning. Second, elements. What game design elements were important for the gamification of learning? And finally, how can we use this information in the language classroom? How can we find out and use gamification in our own classes? Like I said, there's not that much information on gamification of language education. And English education, I found 0 studies actually at this time. So it's really important to find out what parts of gamification are important and then find out how we can actually use this. So the current study, there was certain inclusion criteria. Originally, in my literature search, I used like EBSCOhost and all those fun sites. And I found over 100 gamification studies. But like I said, with a meta-analysis, you need hard information. You need means, standard deviations, all of these little statistics. And most studies were either case studies or opinion surveys or just didn't include enough information. So after searching and finding all the information I needed, it turned out there were only these 14 studies. So notice here we have the study name, the population, who was involved, the end, how many students, what the study itself actually studied. So remember how I said, even though different studies study different things, we can still pull out certain elements. So here this study studied motivation versus engagement versus badge effects, knowledge retention, but the common theme was gamification. So I was still able to pull out information from these studies and compare them against each other as one large meta-analysis. So here again we have results and design. So that's just basically the sample that I was dealt. Keep in mind, this is a little older research, about 5 years ago. There could be a lot more information now. I've been trying to organize things and check, but what you can see here, the most recent one was 2015, so there could be a lot more information now. Now we see here the moderator variables. These are the different things I looked at in terms of each study, or across every study. So we had things like length of instruction. All the studies I found had all this information. I could glean it from their reports. So things like length of instruction, I set up different categories. So 1 to 4 weeks, 5 to 8, 6 to 12, etc. Then I chose collaborative versus competitive. Did the studies have collaborative elements, competitive elements, or both? The subject, I divided that into engineering, computers, science and math, humanities, instruction medium. Some studies like MOOCs were completely online. Some were done only in class, whereas others uses a blended environment. I also looked at things like the age of the subjects. So how old were the students, middle school, elementary, adults. The number of game design elements. Remember we talked about this earlier. Dettering had 5. So how many of those was included? Then gamification learning attribute categories. Landers adapted that to gamification. And then finally, time on task focus. Was it more about the results or more about students spending time with material? What was the actual focus? So here's the analysis of our lovely data. This is what you're going to get when you do a meta-analysis. It's really fun, yeah. Yeah, everyone loves statistics. So here we have R is the correlation coefficient, K is the actual number of studies, here N is the actual total population. So notice here, for example, if we look at length of instruction, 6 studies were in this range, 1 in that, 1 there, etc. Notice here, for example, the instructional medium, or we had 1 in class, 10 mixed, 3 online only. We can also look at time on task. 5 were low time on task, 6 were medium, 3 were high. So then we have the number of the students in the study. So basically, what we can see here is that we have our studies, we have how many people were in each study, and we have our correlation coefficient. So is it positive, is it negative? And then here is the confidence interval, basically how strong is this correlation, or how likely is that this is important, okay? Here I'd like to talk about the results of the study. Basically talk about what I found overall. So overall, it seems that gamification used in education, it seems to have a positive correlation with results. It's not necessarily a strong correlation, but generally it seems that it is somewhat effective. Some studies didn't show positive results, but that could also be tied to the moderator variables. The key thing to remember is that overall there does seem to be a positive correlation between gamification and positive results. Now let's talk about each of the moderator variables that we looked at. So the first was length of instruction. Length of instruction, it turns out there is an actual positive correlation between outcomes in shorter time periods. So longer courses tended to show no real benefit, but shorter instructional periods tended to show good results. This could be because people get bored. If anyone has ever played a game, the more you play the game, the less you tend to enjoy it. This could also be the case in gamification. Even in courses themselves, students tend to burn out towards the end. So longer instruction is not actually better. And it seems here that longer use of gamification is not necessarily a good thing. So we'll put a star here because not all moderator variables really showed anything. Remember, with a meta-analysis, we're looking at lots of different variables to see if they have an impact. And here it turns out length of instruction actually does. In regards to collaborative and competitive aspects of courses, results found that competitive elements may have a slight edge and that competition might be necessary. But at the same time, this wasn't a strong correlation. More important, it seems like there is some sort of collaboration or competition in the gamification element. So this one isn't necessarily that important. The correlation wasn't that strong and the results were somewhat mixed. Next, course subject. As I said, we looked at a few different kinds of courses. Overall, it seemed that science type courses, or especially engineering type courses, computer science, had a strong correlation with positive results. Humanities actually had a somewhat negative correlation. But there was really only one study there, so let's not consider that humanities is bad. It's just that there might not be enough research yet, or the study itself could have been a little flawed. But right now, it seems science fields tend to show a stronger correlation. In terms of the instruction medium, we looked at in-class, blended, and online-only courses. All styles showed positive results in terms of gamification. However, blended learning seemed to show the strongest correlation. This might just be because gamification tends to work well with computers. It's a lot easier to set up all this and give points and whatnot on a computer. So right now, just remember, blended learning style seems to work better. In terms of the age of our subjects, the study was done with elementary school, middle school, high school, adults, and the correlation actually seemed to be stronger with adult learners. Typically, people think of like teenagers or children as loving games, but gamification is sort of similar to video games, and most video game players are young adults in their 20s. So it seems that university age might get the most benefit from this. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that we should completely forget young learners. It could just be that we need more research in this area. Finally, I also looked at game design elements and gamification learning attributes categories. Remember, we talked about this a little earlier. This is just simply ways things from games or gamification elements can be applied and used. So basically I looked at how many of each kind was used. This actually, maybe most interestingly, showed nothing, basically. Some study used only one or two things, some would use the maximum amount, but the correlation, there actually was none, or very small. Basically, what that means is that it doesn't really matter if you use one or two elements or all six. Something else is more important for the success of your study, for the success of your gamification. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different elements, it does not matter. Okay? That's the important thing to take from here. Both of these. It's not necessarily a quantity thing, it seems to be more quality. Finally, we looked at time on task. Time on task, I basically divided into high, medium, and low time on task focus. And this one actually showed pretty strong results. What we found was that studies with medium or high time on task had a stronger correlation with positive results, whereas studies that had low time on task focus didn't have good results. So that means that studies that focused on students spending time with the material, as opposed to just focusing on the outcomes, had stronger positive results. So finally here, we're going to talk about what all those results mean. And I'll give you some things to sort of think about how you can use this or how this could be applied as we go. So first, we're all language teachers or learners, or maybe both. So how we can use this in the classroom is important. One thing that seems really clear is that shorter is better. Studies with long timelines didn't really have strong results, or they were mixed, but shorter applications seem to do a lot better. So my advice would be to consider running this as sort of a module. The university semester here is 15 weeks. In elementary and secondary schools, it's even longer. Don't really think about using gamification for the entire semester. If you look online, there's books and whatnot about using them for the entire semester, but it seems like using it maybe as part of a module or a section of your course might actually have better results. Maybe the time from the beginning of school to midterms. That might work better and sort of help students out and prevent them from getting tired of it. The other thing is supplement. Some courses basically make the gamification the entire course. It becomes the center and the whole course is about gamifying. But it seems to me that this might work better sort of as an addition. Blended learning, which isn't actually very that common here, I feel, but blended learning seemed to show a stronger correlation with positive results. So if you're using an online site already, like a Moodle or your university or school's online section or Google Classroom, it might be a good idea to try and throw some gamification into that. Don't necessarily make it the entire focus, but sort of make it something that can be additional and help and reinforce class learning. The most important thing was here, the results that we found from time on task. It seems that students who spend more time with the material as opposed to the results have stronger outcomes. As language education specialists, we have experience teaching, right? And we know that if we only focus on the test, students don't necessarily learn as much. So that obviously makes sense to us. So when we plan our gamification, we also need to keep that in mind. For example, if we're doing a vocabulary quiz kind of thing with gamification, don't give out points or badges for finishing the exam or getting a perfect score. Review kind of things might be better to gamify. Time spent on task. Don't gamify the outcome, gamify review or learning. If you're using a vocabulary quiz kind of thing, let students take it again and again. Let them type out responses, different things. Allow different students to learn and use and interact with the quiz in different ways so that they can spend more time with it. That seems to be really important. The subject matter didn't really stand out to me as being that important because there just weren't that many humanities studies. And at this time, English education wasn't really even a focus of any studies. So, as I said, the 3 things we really need to keep in mind here: keep it short, supplement, and make sure students are spending time with the material. Don't just focus on the outcome. Here, what we have are sources that were used. I'm not going to read them all, I'm just going to go through them. This is the 14 studies and whatnot that were used and what I referenced here in this presentation. Here, you can find my master's thesis, which will have all of this and more. If you go to the St. Cloud State repository, you can download it there. This is basically everything we need to see. Finally, this was Meta-Analysis and Gamification. As a reminder, I'm Christopher Garland, and you can reach me at either of these 2 emails, christophermgarland@gmail.com or cmgarland@hambat.ac.kr. Thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope you learned something from it. Bye.